When my husband, James, and I moved into our new home, everything seemed perfect. It was an old Victorian house, the kind of place that oozes charm. The sprawling front yard, the wraparound porch, and the intricate woodwork felt like stepping into a fairy tale. But something about the place felt off. Maybe it was the strange heaviness in the air or the way the shadows seemed darker here than in other homes. On the first night, as we unpacked boxes, a faint tapping echoed from upstairs. "Probably just the old pipes," James said, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. I nodded, but unease crept into my chest. This house didn't feel welcoming. It felt like it was watching. The following day, I explored the house alone while James was at work. The upstairs hallway, lined with faded wallpaper, had a peculiar draft. It smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. As I walked past the second bedroom, I heard it, a whisper. It was faint but unmistakable. "Get out." My heart stopped. I froze, straining to listen, but the only sound was my own ragged breathing. I told myself it must have been my imagination. Houses this old were bound to have strange sounds, right? But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, didn't want us here. There was a door at the end of the hallway that refused to open. James and I had tried everything. Keys, prying tools, even brute force, but it wouldn't budge. "It's probably just a storage closet," James said, brushing it off. But every time I walked past it, I felt a chill. The air around the door seemed colder than the rest of the house, and I swore I could hear faint scratching sounds from the other side. One night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard the door creak open. I ran to the hallway, but it was still shut tight. While cleaning the master bedroom, I noticed an old mirror leaning against the wall. It was antique, its surface speckled with age. As I wiped away the dust, something caught my eye, a faint reflection that didn't match the room. Behind me, in the mirror, was a shadowy figure standing by the locked door. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. I told James about it, but he laughed it off. "You've been watching too many horror movies," he said. But I knew what I saw. A week later, while rummaging in the attic, I found an old leather-bound journal tucked inside a rotting trunk. Its pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with messy handwriting. The entries belonged to a man named Thomas Grayson, who had lived in the house over a century ago. The journal chronicled strange events, whispers, shadows, and people disappearing. The last entry read, "I can't take it anymore. The room at the end of the hall must stay locked. It's the only way to keep it contained. God help us all." That night I couldn't sleep. The air felt thick, and the house groaned as though alive. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the faint tapping from upstairs. But this time it wasn't faint. It grew louder and more insistent until it sounded like fists pounding on the walls. James and I bolted out of bed. The noise seemed to come from the locked room. As we approached, the door began to shake violently, as if something inside was trying to break free. "Stay back," James shouted, but I was rooted to the spot. The door burst open with a deafening crash, revealing darkness so deep it seemed to suck the light from the hallway. From the shadows emerged a grotesque figure. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its body was a twisted, pulsating mass of black smoke and sharp angles. It let out a guttural growl that vibrated through my chest. James grabbed my arm, pulling me away. "Run!" We fled downstairs, but the entity followed, its heavy footsteps echoing behind us. I turned to see it stretching its clawed hand toward me, and I screamed. We bolted out of the house and into the street, not stopping until we were a safe distance away. When we looked back, the house stood silent and still, as though nothing had happened. We called the police, but they found no signs of forced entry or anything unusual inside the house. But we knew the truth. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and whatever was in that locked room wasn't finished with us. A month later, we moved to a cramped apartment across town. One night, as I unpacked, I heard a faint tapping on the wall. My heart stopped. Turning slowly, I saw it, the old mirror from the house, and in its surface, the shadowy figure stared back at me. It whispered, "You can't escape." When we first saw the house, it felt like it was meant to be ours. It was a Victorian-era home, nestled at the edge of a quiet, forested town. Its towering spires, intricate woodwork, and wraparound porch seemed to beckon us inside. James, my husband, was thrilled. I tried to share his excitement, but something about the house felt wrong. The real estate agent had mentioned the house had been vacant for years, but she was vague about why. Just one of those things, she'd said, brushing off our questions with a nervous laugh. The moment we stepped inside, the air felt heavy. The smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic hung in the air. But James only saw potential. The first night, we were too exhausted from moving to unpack. We slept on our mattress in the living room, surrounded by boxes. Around midnight, I woke to a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It seemed to come from upstairs. I nudged James awake. "It's probably the old pipes," he murmured, half asleep. But it didn't sound like pipes. It sounded like fingers tapping on wood. I told myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next day, while James was at work, I explored the house. Most rooms were dusty but otherwise ordinary, except for one. At the end of the upstairs hallway was a door that wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pushed, pulled, or turned the handle, it refused to budge. It felt colder near that door, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. As I stood there, I thought I heard a faint scratching sound from the other side. I backed away, heart racing. I decided not to tell James. A week later, while unpacking, I found an antique mirror in the attic. It was tall, with an ornate frame, and the glass was spotted with age. I decided to place it in our bedroom. That night, as I brushed my hair in front of it, I noticed something odd. The reflection didn't quite match the room. Behind me, in the mirror, was the locked door from the hallway, and standing in front of it was a shadowy figure. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. While cleaning the attic, I stumbled upon an old, leather-bound journal tucked inside a box. The handwriting inside was shaky and frantic. The journal belonged to a man named Thomas Grayson, who had lived in the house over a century ago. The entries grew increasingly disturbed. He wrote about whispers in the night, shadows moving where they shouldn't, and people disappearing. The final entry chilled me to my core. The locked door must never be opened. It's the only thing keeping it contained. If the door is breached, God help us all. That night, the tapping started again. But this time, it was louder. It sounded like it was coming from the hallway. James, tired of my complaints, decided to investigate. "We'll figure this out and put your mind at ease," he said. As we approached the locked door, it began to tremble. The tapping turned to pounding. "Stay back," James warned, but I couldn't move. With a deafening crash, the door burst open. Cold air rushed out, and the room beyond was pitch black, as though the light was being swallowed. From the darkness emerged a figure. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its eyes glowed faintly, like dying embers. James grabbed my hand. "We need to leave. Now." But as we turned, the thing lunged. Its claws raked the air just inches from my face. It let out a guttural, animalistic growl that seemed to shake the walls. We fled down the stairs, the entity following, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. We barely made it outside. The moment we crossed the threshold, the entity stopped, lingering in the doorway. Its glowing eyes stared at us, filled with rage. James called the police, but they found nothing unusual. No sign of forced entry, no creature, no strange room at the end of the hallway. The locked door was intact. "Old houses make noises," the officer said. "Maybe you were just stressed." But I knew better. We moved out the following week. Our new apartment was small and cramped, but at least it felt normal. Or so I thought. One night, while unpacking, I heard a familiar sound. Faint, rhythmic tapping. I turned toward the source and saw the antique mirror propped against the wall. Its surface shimmered unnaturally, and in its depths, the glowing eyes stared back at me. The tapping grew louder, and then the whisper came. "You can't escape." I tried to move, but I was frozen in place. The shadowy figure in the mirror began to claw at the glass, cracks spreading across the surface. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and went out. When they came back on, the mirror was empty, but the whisper lingered in the air, closer this time. And then I saw it, its shadow standing behind me. The house was everything James and I had dreamed of. Nestled at the edge of a quiet forest, the Victorian-style home stood tall and proud. It had intricate woodwork, a wraparound porch, and a history that whispered of a bygone era. But beneath its charm was a stillness that I couldn't ignore. "Isn't it beautiful?" James asked, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "It is," I replied, forcing a smile. But something felt off. The air inside was cold and heavy, carrying the faint smell of damp wood and iron. The real estate agent mentioned the house had been vacant for decades. When I asked why, she hesitated before brushing it off as unlucky timing with past buyers. I didn't believe her. Moving was exhausting, so we decided to sleep in the living room on our mattress, surrounded by boxes. The night was eerily quiet. No distant hum of traffic, no chirping crickets, just silence. I woke around 2 a.m. to a faint tapping sound. It was soft and rhythmic, coming from upstairs. "James," I whispered, nudging him awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned, half asleep. "Probably the pipes. Old houses do that." I nodded, trying to convince myself he was right. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, almost insistent, like fingers drumming on wood. The next morning, James left for work, leaving me to unpack alone. Exploring the house during the day was meant to reassure me, but it did the opposite. The upstairs hallway was the worst. It was long and narrow, lined with faded wallpaper that seemed to peel away in jagged strips. At the end of the hall was a door. It was locked. No matter how hard I turned the handle or pushed, it wouldn't budge. The air around it was colder, and there was a faint metallic smell, like rust or blood. As I stood there, I thought I heard a soft scraping sound coming from the other side. While rummaging in the attic for decorations, I found an antique mirror wrapped in an old cloth. Its frame was ornate, carved with swirling patterns that reminded me of vines. The glass was slightly cracked and speckled with age. I decided to hang it in our bedroom. That night, as I brushed my hair in front of it, I noticed something strange. The reflection didn't match the room exactly. Behind me, in the mirror, the hallway seemed darker, and the locked door was slightly ajar. My heart raced as I turned around. The door was closed, just as it had been earlier. When I looked back at the mirror, everything appeared normal. It wasn't long before the whispers started. At first, they were faint, just a soft, indecipherable murmur that I could write off as the wind. But soon they grew louder, more distinct. Late one night, I heard it clearly. "Get out!" I froze in bed, my heart pounding. James was sound asleep beside me. I told myself it wasn't real, that I was imagining things. But the next morning, I found scratches on the locked door. They weren't there before. Determined to understand what was happening, I started searching the house for answers. In the attic, I found an old trunk filled with personal belongings. Photographs, letters, and a leather-bound journal. The journal belonged to a man named Thomas Grayson, who had lived in the house over a century ago. His entries started innocently enough, but they quickly became frantic and paranoid. He wrote about strange noises, shadows that moved on their own, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. The final entries were almost illegible, scrawled in desperation. "The locked door is the only thing keeping it contained. It must never be opened." That night, the house came alive. The whispers were louder, echoing through the halls. The tapping sound returned, accompanied by heavy footsteps pacing upstairs. James, finally fed up, decided to confront whatever was happening. He grabbed a crowbar and headed toward the locked door. "Don't," I pleaded, clutching his arm. "It's not safe." But he didn't listen. With a grunt, he forced the door open. Cold air rushed out, and the smell of decay filled the hallway. Beyond the door was darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light. Then we heard it. A low growl, deep and guttural, that shook the walls. From the shadows emerged a figure. It was tall and humanoid but distorted. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its movements jerky and insect-like. Its eyes glowed red, burning like embers in the void. James stepped back, his face pale. "What is that?" The creature lunged. We barely dodged its claws, which raked the wall, leaving deep gouges. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing James's hand. We bolted down the stairs, the entity chasing us. Its footsteps were heavy, its growls filling the air with a bone-deep terror. We burst out of the house into the cold night. The creature stopped at the threshold, its glowing eyes fixed on us. It couldn't leave the house, but its presence was a threat that lingered. The next day, we packed our belongings and left. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and whatever was inside wanted us gone. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. A week later, in our new apartment, I thought we were safe. But then, late one night, I heard it. The tapping. I turned toward the sound and froze. The antique mirror from the house was leaning against the wall, though I hadn't brought it with me. In its reflection, the hallway behind me was dark. And standing there, its glowing red eyes staring back at me, was the creature. It whispered, "You can't escape." Before I could scream, the lights went out. We found the house after months of searching. A towering Victorian mansion at the edge of a dense forest, priced so low it seemed too good to be true. James fell in love with it immediately. I tried to match his excitement, but something about the place unsettled me. The agent had called it a fixer-upper, glossing over its eerie silence and the faint smell of damp wood. Still, it had potential. We signed the papers and moved in within weeks. On our first night, as we lay on a mattress in the empty living room, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint, rhythmic tapping, soft at first but persistent. "James," I whispered, nudging him. "Do you hear that?" He groaned. "It's an old house. Probably the pipes." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the sound was deliberate, like someone, or something, was trying to get our attention. The next morning, I explored the upstairs hallway. The air was colder up there, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. At the end of the hall, I found a door. Unlike the others, it was locked, with no key in sight. "Did the agent mention this door?" I asked James. He shrugged. "It's probably just a storage room," but it didn't feel like just a storage room. The air around it was heavy, and I could have sworn I heard faint scratching noises coming from the other side. While unpacking in the attic, I found an antique mirror wrapped in an old cloth. Its frame was ornate, carved with swirling patterns, and the glass was speckled with age. I decided to hang it in our bedroom, thinking it might add some character. But that night, as I stood in front of it brushing my hair, I noticed something strange. The reflection of the hallway behind me didn't look right. The shadows seemed deeper, and the locked door was slightly ajar. I spun around, my heart racing, but the door was closed. When I looked back at the mirror, the hallway appeared normal again. It started with faint murmurs, just as I was about to drift off to sleep. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew clearer over the next few nights. They came from the direction of the locked door. "Get out," one of them said. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. Beside me, James snored softly, oblivious. The next morning, I found scratches on the locked door, long, deep gouges that hadn't been there before. Determined to find answers, I returned to the attic and searched through the piles of old belongings. In an old chest, I found a leather-bound journal. It belonged to a man named Thomas Grayson, who had lived in the house over a century ago. The entries started innocently, describing renovations and family gatherings. But as the pages went on, the tone changed. Thomas wrote of strange noises, cold drafts, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. His final entries were frantic. "It's trapped behind the door. The lock is the only thing keeping it contained. I hear it scratching, whispering. I fear what will happen if it ever gets out. I begged James to leave the house, but he wouldn't listen. He thought I was being paranoid. One night, after hearing the whispers again, James decided to investigate the locked door. "I'll prove to you there's nothing to be afraid of," he said, grabbing a crowbar. "James, please don't," I pleaded, but he was already prying the door open. With a final wrench, the lock snapped, and the door swung wide. Cold air rushed out, carrying the stench of decay. The room beyond was pitch black, and the shadows seemed to writhe like living things. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl. From the darkness emerged a figure. It was humanoid but grotesquely distorted. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its eyes glowed like embers. James froze, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" Before I could answer, the creature lunged. We barely dodged its claws, which tore into the wall, leaving deep, smoldering gouges. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing James's hand. We fled down the stairs, the entity close behind. Its footsteps were heavy, its growls echoing through the house. We burst out of the house into the cold night air. The creature stopped at the threshold, its glowing eyes fixed on us. It couldn't leave the house, but its presence was a lingering threat. We didn't go back inside. Instead, we packed what little we could fit into the car and left. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house. The front door was wide open, and in the shadows, I could see the creature watching us. We moved into a small apartment in the city, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. For a while, it seemed like we had. But then, one night, I heard it. The faint tapping sound that had haunted me in the old house. I turned toward the source and froze. There, leaning against the wall, was the antique mirror from the house. I hadn't brought it with me. In the mirror's reflection, the room looked darker. Shadows writhed like smoke, and the hallway stretched unnaturally long. At the far end, glowing red eyes stared back at me. The figure stepped closer, its clawed hands pressing against the glass as if trying to break through. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice low and menacing. Before I could scream, the mirror cracked, and the lights went out. The tapping sound grew louder.